Saddam Hussein's last day, a journey from defiance to destiny. What does it mean to face the end of a life defined by power, fear, and infamy? On December 30th, 2006, Saddam Hussein, Iraq's once unassailable dictator, stood at the gallows, his final moments a stark contrast to the iron grip he once held over a nation. His last 24 hours were a whirlwind of defiance, dignity, and unexpected humanity, revealing a man who, even in death, captivated the world. What did he say in his final hours? How did he prepare for the inevitable? And what can his story teach us about justice, redemption, and the complexities of the human spirit? Join us as we uncover the intimate details of Saddam Hussein's final day, piecing together eyewitness accounts, guard testimonies, and the echoes of a nation forever changed by his legacy. The day before, a quiet before the storm. On Friday, December 29, Saddam Hussein awoke in his modest cell at Camp Victory, a U.S. military base near Baghdad's airport, unaware that his life was ticking down to its final hours. The Super 12, an elite unit of American soldiers from the 551 St. Military Police Company tasked with guarding him, sensed a shift in the air. For days, subtle signs had hinted at an approaching end. His lawyers had visited, his family had been granted rare access, and just the previous day, he'd met with two half-brothers in an emotional reunion. The soldiers, who had nicknamed Saddam Vic, short for very important criminal, were on edge, their instincts telling them something monumental was coming. Saddam's day unfolded with the routine he'd grown accustomed to over 3 years in custody. He tended to his small garden outside his cell, watering weeds with care, as if they were prized roses. He treated those weeds like they were the most beautiful flowers, one guard recalled, a poignant glimpse into the man behind the myth. His final meal was a surprising indulgence. Lobster tails from the Coalition Cafe at Camp Victory, a treat that prompted a rare joke from Saddam. "I've grown fat like an American," he quipped, chuckling at his own weight gain in captivity. That evening, as he savored his meal, the execution papers were signed in secret. At 1:30 a.m., Judge Munir Haddad received the order, setting the stage for a day that would echo through history. Life in captivity, the dictator as a man. Saddam's 3 years in U.S. custody revealed a side of him rarely seen during his decades of rule. The Super 12, who spent countless hours with him, developed a complex relationship with their prisoner. They described him as meticulous, charismatic, and even disarming. He insisted on eating his breakfast in precise order. First an omelet, perfectly intact, or he'd refuse it. Then a muffin, followed by fresh fruit. He listened to Mary J. Blige on a small radio, her soulful voice a curious backdrop to his solitude. He shared stories of his childhood in Tikrit, his rise to power, and his regrets, not for his crimes, but for the enemies he'd failed to crush. The guards, initially wary, grew to see Saddam as more than a tyrant. He wasn't just a monster, one soldier later said. He was a guy who liked his coffee black, who got annoyed when his socks didn't match, who missed his daughters. This human connection, forged in the confines of a cell, added a layer of complexity to Saddam's final chapter, reminding us that even the most notorious figures carry traces of ordinary humanity. The final hours, a dance with fate, the midnight revelation. At 3:00 a.m. on Saturday, December 30, 2006, the stillness of Saddam's cell was shattered. First Lieutenant Andre Jackson, accompanied by an interpreter, entered and switched on the light. Knowing Saddam's aversion to being rushed, they spoke calmly. "Sir, you've been scheduled for execution in a few hours." The interpreter, who had worked with Saddam for 15 months, later called it the hardest moment of my life. Their relationship had evolved beyond guard and prisoner, tinged with mutual respect, making the announcement feel like a betrayal. Saddam's response was startlingly composed. "I've been sentenced to death before," he said, his voice steady, as if he'd rehearsed this moment. He sat on the edge of his cot, his dark eyes betraying no fear, only a quiet acceptance. This stoicism, so at odds with his fearsome reputation, left the guards in awe. "He wasn't begging or crying," Jackson recalled. "He just was." Preparing for the end. At 3:24 a.m., Saddam requested to bathe, using the small sink in his cell. The guards stepped back, giving him privacy as he washed himself with deliberate care, like a man preparing for a sacred ritual. He dyed his graying hair black, trimmed his silver beard, and dressed with precision. Ironed black pants, a crisp white shirt, a luxurious black topcoat, and polished shoes. A brief moment of frustration arose when he couldn't find matching socks, prompting a soldier to rummage through his belongings to help. Even at the end, he wanted to look like the president he once was, the soldier noted. Saddam's attention to detail wasn't vanity, it was defiance. He wanted to face death on his terms, as a leader, not a broken man. He gathered a few possessions, including a dark green Quran, which he clutched tightly, a symbol of his faith and resolve. The final journey, from cell to gallows. In the pre-dawn hours, U.S. forces transferred Saddam from Camp Cropper to Baghdad's Green Zone, where he was handed over to Iraqi authorities. An armored convoy then transported him to Kadhimiya, a neighborhood steeped in irony. The execution site was a former military intelligence base where Saddam's regime had executed countless opponents. At 5:00 a.m., our 14 Iraqi officials, including Judge Munir Haddad and prosecutor Monkeith Al-Faroun, boarded U.S. helicopters for a 15-minute flight to the base, the Tigris River shimmering below in the early light. Saddam arrived at the facility under heavy guard, his presence commanding despite the handcuffs. The air was thick with tension, the weight of history palpable. It felt like the whole world was watching, Haddad later said, and in a way, it was. The execution, defiance at the gallows, the formal verdict. In a small, stark room with a desk, chairs, and a humming refrigerator, Judge Haddad began reading the verdict and appeals court ruling, as required by Iraqi law. Saddam stood tall, his voice cutting through the recitation with defiant proclamations, "We are in heaven, and our enemies are in hell," and "Down with the Persians and the Americans." Haddad, undeterred, raised his voice louder, asserting authority. "He wanted to dominate the room, but I wouldn't let him," Haddad recalled. The exchange was a final clash of wills, a dictator refusing to bow even in his last hour. The gallows chamber. Saddam was led to the execution chamber, a cavernous room with no windows, its air heavy with cold and the stench of death, as Haddad described. A tall gallows loomed, its staircase leading to a platform above a pit. As he approached, a masked executioner confronted him, voice trembling with anger. "You destroyed Iraq, made us beggars, while we sit on rivers of oil." Saddam's eyes flashed with indignation. "I made Iraq rich and powerful," he retorted, unyielding to the end. At the gallows, Saddam handed his Quran to an official, requesting it be given to the son of his co-defendant, Awad Bandar, a rare gesture of loyalty. The executioners removed his handcuffs, recuffed his hands behind his back, and bound his feet. When offered a black hood to ease his suffering, Saddam refused, saying, "I want to see my enemies' faces." The executioner, respecting his choice, folded the hood and wrapped it around his neck like a scarf, a makeshift gesture in a moment of grim formality. The final breath. Standing on the platform, the noose tight around his neck, Saddam began reciting the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." The room erupted with chaos as some Shiite witnesses chanted, "Muqtada, Muqtada, Muqtada," invoking the anti-American cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. Saddam's lips curled into a sarcastic smile. "Muqtada?" He scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. Another voice shouted, "Go to hell!" while a third declared, "Long live Muhammad Bakr Sadr." Prosecutor Al-Faroun intervened, his voice firm. "The man is facing death. Show respect." But Saddam, undeterred, continued his prayer, his words steady against the cacophony. "Allah is the greatest, the nation will be victorious, and Palestine is Arab," he proclaimed, a final act of defiance. At 5:50 a.m. local time, 10:05 p.m. ET, December 29th, the trapdoor snapped open. "He died in a tenth of a second," Al-Faroun later said. Not a twitch, not a sound. Saddam's body hung for 5 minutes, then was lowered, covered with a white sheet, and pronounced dead by a doctor with a simple, "It's finished." Aftermath. A nation divided. Saddam's body was flown back to the Green Zone by helicopter, and Iraqi television announced his execution at 10:00 a.m., sending shockwaves through the country. On December 31st, his remains were returned to his birthplace, Al-Auja, near Tikrit, and buried beside family members under a somber sky. For some Iraqis, his death was justice for decades of oppression. For others, it was the loss of a symbol of national strength, however flawed. The execution, marred by sectarian chants, deepened Iraq's divisions, foreshadowing the turbulent years ahead. The Super 12, who had guarded Saddam until the end, grappled with their own emotions. "He was a monster, but he was our monster," one soldier reflected. "We saw him laugh, cry, pray. That changes you." Their bond with Saddam, however unlikely, underscored the power of human connection, even in the shadow of death. Ethical reflections: justice or vengeance? Saddam's execution raises enduring questions. Was his death a necessary act of justice for his crimes, genocide, mass executions, chemical warfare, or a rushed act of vengeance that fueled Iraq's sectarian strife? The chaotic scene at the gallows, with taunts and chants, suggested a loss of dignity, prompting criticism from human rights groups. "An execution should be solemn, not a circus," one advocate argued. Yet, for victims of his regime, like the Kurds of Halab, his death was a long overdue reckoning. The Super 12's accounts add another layer. Their stories of Saddam's garden, his love for music, and his quiet moments of reflection challenge us to see beyond the caricature of a dictator. Can we condemn a man's crimes while acknowledging his humanity? And what does it mean for a nation to move forward when its past is so deeply scarred? Resilience and hope. Lessons from the ashes. Amid the tragedy, glimmers of resilience shine through. Families of Saddam's victims, like those who survived the Anfal genocide, have rebuilt communities, preserving their culture through schools and memorials. In Tikrit, some residents honor Saddam's memory not as a tyrant, but as a local son who brought electricity and schools to their town, showing the complexity of legacy. The Super 12 E2 found meaning in their duty, with some becoming advocates for veterans' mental health, using their experience to help others heal. Iraq's journey since 2006 has been fraught, but grassroots efforts, women's cooperatives, youth education programs, interfaith dialogues offer hope for reconciliation. These stories remind us that even in the wake of tyranny and division, humanity can find paths to renewal. Conclusion: a legacy in question. Saddam Hussein's final 24 hours were a microcosm of his life, defiant, complex, and indelibly human. From his meticulous preparations to his unyielding words at the gallows, he faced death as he lived, on his own terms. Yet, the relationships he forged with his guards, the chaos of his execution, and the divided nation he left behind reveal a story far richer than one man's end. They challenge us to grapple with questions of justice, forgiveness, and the power of human connection in the darkest moments. What does Saddam's death teach us about the cost of power and the hope for healing? How do we balance retribution with redemption? If these questions stir you, dive deeper into the stories of history's pivotal figures and the lessons they leave behind. Share your thoughts, and let's continue exploring the human spirit's triumphs and trials together.